programs and was the co-chair of Oregon Ending Homeless Advisory Council. Before she leaves, because she's a former reporter and probably will anticipate being asked this question, the rumor is that you are planning on running for governor in 2022. So you can answer that question.
Okay. Well, wow, what a great introduction. Thank you. And would you like me to stand? Can you hear and see me okay from here? If this is okay, I'd like to keep it informal. I do have a prepared presentation. I'm certainly open to questions at the end, or if you have something really burning, interesting that you just can't wait, feel free to interrupt me. And just let me say, all questions are on the table. That has always been my position in every presentation I've done about my journey. And so far, I haven't been asked one thing that I felt uncomfortable with answering. So, just let me say, I really feel, especially because my journey has been so well supported and so accepted, that I have an obligation, and even more than that, a real desire to share my story with anybody who has an interest. So thank you all for being here today, and I hope you find it a worthy way to spend your lunch hour. Let me add, I am 59 years old, so I started this journey publicly, at least, at age 58. And the whys of that I will address later in the presentation. So I've got a couple of goals today to give what I would call a very brief history of modern transgender identity, and also share some of the highlights of my own story. I want to offer a couple of important disclaimers. First, I'm not a medical or a psychological expert, and I'm only an expert on my own story. Does anybody here recall the great spread the Oregonian did about me beginning of June last year on Sunday? I'm seeing a couple of nods. And they called it Becoming Claire, which was fine, but I really felt, an alternate title could have been Results Not Typical, because I have enjoyed, again, acceptance, support, opportunities that unfortunately too many transgender people are denied today. So here is a mouthful. This is the only slide I'm going to read in its entirety. This could be a whole presentation by itself, but sometimes people ask, have there always been transgender people? Will there always be transgender people? What does this mean in the larger question of gender roles? Any Simpsons fans in here? Okay, I'm seeing several. Well, Lisa Simpson is known for saying things wise beyond her years. Now, this was a created meme, but still, somehow I think Lisa saying it adds something. So just kind of file this away for future thought, but saying trans people have existed forever is colonial and ahistorical. Transgender as a concept was only realized and only makes sense within a society that assigns binary gender identities at birth through the erasure and destruction of non-Western genders. A lot of us struggle with understanding our gender within these white supremacist frameworks, because a lot of time it's less about being trapped in the wrong body and more about being trapped in colonial gender frameworks. So there's a mouthful, huh? But to step back again to history of transgender identity, some of you may have seen a wonderful film that came out just a few years ago called The Danish Girl, and I'm seeing a few nods, and that is, they took some liberties as film biographies do, but the essential story is true about a Danish painter who began dressing as a woman almost as a lark, and then quickly discovered her true gender identity, and her name was Lili Ebe, and her surgical procedures took place in the early 1930s, and today now she is historically recognized as the first person to transition through surgery. The really first famous transgender person, or transsexual as the term was, in this country was in the early 1950s. Her name was Christine Jorgensen, and the classic era of tabloid headlines, the New York Daily News, when she came back to the United States after having undergone her surgical procedures in Denmark. There's the two pictures of her on the front page as a private first class clerk in World War II, and then Christine, ex-GI, becomes blonde beauty. So a little bit of terminology, and even some of my very supportive friends who have shown a desire to learn have said, you know, they're confused because the terminology changes. And yes, it is changing and it's evolving. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager back in the 70s, and the common term people still spoke about sex change surgery. More recently, it was called gender reassignment surgery. But the current term, and one that I really appreciate for a lot of reasons, is because I think it gets closest to the truth, is gender confirmation surgery. Because you're really not changing gender, so you're physically becoming the gender that you've always known that you were. A couple of other things I'd like to mention is you do not have to have surgery, you do not have to have other medical interventions like hormone therapy to be transgender. If you identify as transgender, you are. And I think it's pretty much that simple. Again, evolving terminology. This used to be called, in medical terms, gender identity disorder. A few years ago, they changed it to gender dysphoria, which I think is a lot more appropriate. And again, the official textbook definition of gender dysphoria is the condition of feeling that one's emotional and psychological identity as male or female to be opposite to one's biological sex. Okay, but to, I think, put that in simpler terms, and this is the best description I've ever heard. The woman pictured there, her name is Sarah McBride, and she is very active with the Human Rights Campaign, Washington, D.C., one of the leading LGBTQ advocacy organizations in the country. She herself is transgender, and that picture of her is from the 2016 Democratic National Convention. She became the first publicly transgender person ever to speak at a national political convention. But here's how I heard her describe it in a TED Talk, and it just really kind of blew me away, because I said, yeah, this is what I felt. Like a homesickness in your own body that never goes away. Let me say that again, like a homesickness in your own body that never goes away. So a year and 2 weeks ago, when I came to work in the county commissioner's office for the first time as Claire, I've cried a lot more since transition. Maybe it's just being freed, maybe it's hormonal influences, but one of the first things when I saw they had put on my door, and the tag is still there, it said, "Welcome home, Claire." Okay, a little bit more about history. Dr. Harry Benjamin in the 1950s really became the very first researcher to publish and really become prominent in studying transgender identity. He wrote the book on the right called The Transsexual Phenomenon. And I just want to quote one thing from his work that I found significant. He said he never, ever saw a person cured of transsexuality through any kind of therapy. He said, only hormones and surgery will bring relief. And this was in 1966. He predicted that someday a medical basis would be found for this condition. And again, I'm not an expert. If you want to learn more, I'd advise looking at Google and trusted sources, but the proof really is coming. There have been post-mortem brain studies of transgender women, brain scans, genetic studies, that it hasn't reached the point where it's, I think, commonly scientifically accepted, but the data is building up that yes, that something is happening in brain development that tips somebody towards being trans. So, see that little feller sitting there? That is me. I'm going to say probably about 8 or 9 months old. And I look at that picture now and I see somebody who maybe looks a little puzzled, knows that something fundamental isn't quite right, but isn't quite sure what it is yet. So one of the most common questions I get is when did I realize that I was trans? Remember, I reached age 5 in 1965, and the word wasn't even part of the lexicon, but I think that is the first time that I can say with certainty that I look back and I knew I was different. I went to kindergarten. I knew I really didn't fit in socially with the boys at all. I felt a lot closer to the girls, and yet I knew I wasn't one of them, or at least that's what the world kept telling me. But I didn't even really learn that it was possible to transition until my teen years. And two famous transgender people from the 1970s that I remember. On the left, you have Jan Morris, a British journalist who is still pretty active in her late 80s now. On the right, a tennis player named Christine Jorgensen. She actually, had been a very good tennis player in college, became an eye surgeon in New York City, very successful, but after she transitioned in her early 40s, was persuaded to play in a small local professional tournament, which led to her being outed, against her desires journalistically. But again, I think she stepped up, and her fight, which is a fight still going on today, if you followed the news at all, over whether people who are transgender should be allowed to compete professionally in sports. So let me jump to another common question. Why did I wait so long? I'm going to say, like a lot of folks, I feared acceptance by my family and the public. There's something called medical gatekeeping, that if you aren't considered qualified by the psychological and medical communities as a good candidate to transition, you likely won't be accepted. And luckily, it's a pretty wide gate now, but back in the 1970s and 80s, it was a pretty narrow gate. There was a real premium placed on people who, after transitioning, could pass undetected as their new gender identity. And frankly, I know that, I look a lot different than I did, say, 2 years ago, but and even with the effects of hormones, change in my wardrobe, change in my hairstyle, I'm never going to change the fact that I'm 6 feet tall, that I have wide shoulders, and so I know that I'll probably never pass in the sense of that word, but that doesn't bother me anymore. And, expense was certainly a factor back in the 1980s. There was no way, just economically, I could have done it, even if I wanted to. And then something that is really kind of dawned